On. Okay, got it. Is it on now?
That's on. Yeah,
okay.
We're certainly projecting.
Okay, that. Yeah. Tom, can you hear me back there? Okay. All right.
Sounds pretty loud. Okay, good. Then I'll leave it on that. And good. You're on mute here, Dr.
Ready to fascinate us again.
No.
Did you say you heard from Jimmy?
Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Now, I am remiked today in the church's sound system, and I know that last week some of you had a little difficulty in hearing. So if, in fact, you would like to borrow one of the church's amplification aids, Norma has them here. And in the offering plate, she will pass them out, and anybody who needs one can use one and put the little device in your ear. So make sure that, you see Norma over here, so let her know if you need some extra amplification. See, this is very difficult for me because I have such a loud school teacher voice that it's always hard for me to believe anybody I'm not blowing them out here, so to speak. So I'm delighted all of you are here, and I personally feel like it is springtime because the sun is out. So I myself will go out there when the snow melts and look for the heads of my daffodils, which will give me great pleasure to see some signs of spring here. I want to go back and say a few words about where we've been and then pick up and move right on in to the Second Great Awakening, because the Second Great Awakening really is Tennessee history. And I think that all of you in Tennessee, whether you've been here for 3 weeks or you've been here for your whole life, probably are interested in this for one reason or another. We hear Tennessee and Nashville both called so many things. The buckle of the Bible Belt I've heard used. The Protestant Vatican, I've heard that title used. And today we're going to talk about Nashville being the golden candlestick of the Lord. So that one is not quite as well known. So consider yourself, at least for an hour, seated in a place where some people refer to it as the golden candlestick of the Lord. Now, as you know, we talked about the settlement. The Anglicans came into Virginia, the Chesapeake area, and then south into the southern colonies. Church of England, Episcopalian today, over here on this side of the Atlantic, that is. In come the Puritans into Massachusetts. They are not a religiously tolerant group of people. They are religious, but they are not particularly tolerant. New York, back before it became New York, when it was New Amsterdam, was the most heterogeneous place you can imagine, and probably one of the most heterogeneous cities in the whole world, not just here in the 13 colonies. So you've got a great deal of diversity there from day one when the Dutch transferred the property over, so to speak, to the English. You see that the English did not come in and try to impose any religious restrictions on New York. And approximately the same time that that's going on, you also see the colony of Pennsylvania being established as a proprietary colony by William Penn, who had become a Quaker. The Quakers were in fact Christians. They did not baptize. Some see them as the enlightened and part of the Enlightenment. Others see the Quakers as somewhat conservative. So we're going to talk about them a little bit later today when we talk about the public schools in New York and the crisis that they had over religion. So you've got William Penn wanting religious tolerance from the very beginning in Pennsylvania. He tried to recruit people, so to speak, from Germany, from other parts of Europe who were dissatisfied to come. You would be welcome here. And so we see synagogues being built fairly quickly in the 1730s, 1740s in Rhode Island, William Penn colony, Newport, in Philadelphia, in New York City, and in Charleston. And people come, and Charleston is an interesting something to consider, that Jews felt welcome to come into Charleston earlier than they did in Boston. But I think what you would have to say is that the South Carolina as a colony was not particularly religious at all, because really South Carolina as a colony was established to provide a way to feed a large slave population down in the Caribbean. And the reason they didn't want to take any of the land on those islands and raise food to feed the slaves is they wanted those slaves working in those sugar fields, because sugar was as valuable, if not more valuable, than tobacco. And they wanted to maximize the profit. They could raise food up here on Carolina. And so you see, there were relatively few white people in the Carolinas when they were settled, because the population was largely slaves. And there's some very interesting historical studies that have been done in the past 10 or 15 years comparing slavery in the Carolinas with slavery in Virginia. And they're very, very different. The slaves in the Carolinas had very little contact with English Anglicans, and so consequently they were able to preserve better, more easily, some hints of their language and some hints of their religious tradition. And there's a fascinating study now that's been done about the Gullah people off of the coast of South Carolina. Some of you I know are aware of that, and the preservation of the language, and people can take the language that has come down and put it in a particular place in Africa, which I think is just fascinating. I can't imagine how difficult that work would be to do that kind of work. But nonetheless, you see, the Carolinas are token Anglicans, but they're not really very religious at all. And so we have the 13 colonies. And as I mentioned, we have this religious movement. It's very short, and it kind of gets a little too much attention, in my personal opinion, about helping lead to the American Revolution and defining what we are as Americans. But I think it is significant because you have, if nothing else, it sets the stage, the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, which I talked about last week. It sets the stage for another religious revival after 1800, the Second Great Awakening, and that's where we get to stand on the stage here in Tennessee. So here we have this short-lived Great Awakening telling people, you have a right to think for yourself. You can make a decision, and this whole notion that I know what's best for me is very, very powerful. It's still very powerful today. So that is followed in quick order by the Enlightenment. And all of you know a great deal about this, I'm sure. We have thinkers in the United States taking the ideas of thinkers in England and in Europe, John Locke and others, and bringing them into a sort of an American interpretation of these ideas. And these ideas are, all people are created equal. Now, what does equality mean? That's a kind of a slippery slope. But these ideals are out there, and this is ultimately going to lead us up to the American Revolution. So, you know that in the middle of all of this, these colonies have to come up with a new government. You're not going to be a colony anymore after 1776. You're going to be a state. And they really saw themselves as a state, as an independent country, a little state. Big government, bad; small control, home control, good. So they saw themselves in this light, and each of these new states, 13, start writing a state constitution. And there was quite a fuss in Virginia. Remember, The Anglicans are the dominant religion in Virginia, and that's who we're fighting for our independence. And there is quite a fuss about whether or not Virginia should have a state religion. And as I mentioned last week, we had Baptist preachers being arrested in Virginia for not having a license from the state to preach. Now, can you imagine what that would do? A license from the state to preach? So the Baptists in Virginia were imprisoned, and they actually kind of liked that in a way, in that it gives you an opportunity to tell about how oppressed and mistreated you are. So in Virginia, the Baptists partner up with none other than the writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, to come up with some kind of a bill to be passed by the new legislature of the state of Virginia that will guarantee religion. In other words, it will disestablish religion. And Jefferson and the Baptist ideas could not have been further apart, but the fact was he believed that everybody should be allowed to worship according to his or her conscience. And so the two of them together, the Baptist Church and Thomas Jefferson, draft this bill, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Now, Virginia doesn't get around to passing that. It is debated hot and heavy. And as I said last week, one of the leading opponents of it was Patrick Henry, who said, you know, we'll just go wild if we don't have an official church. We'll just be willy-nilly. People will be doing whatever they please. I mean, so he was very much opposed to this, and it passes finally in 1786. Now, just to give you a little kind of a chronological framework, the American Revolution ended, we say, with the Battle of Yorktown, or Cornwallis's surrender, in 1781. It takes us 2 years to get a peace treaty with England. And the peace treaty is signed in 1783, in which England recognizes the United States of America. Now, please make sure that you understand the United States is plural. It is a plural phrase, not a singular. And so they see themselves as 13 states that are united. And they have this document called the Articles of Confederation holding these 13 independent states together, but you could not really call it a central government because it only had a legislative branch, and the legislative branch was completely subservient to anything that the states wanted to do, and so it didn't work. We have a little economic crisis. Trade seems to be a problem, and they go back to the drawing board to redo the articles. They end up throwing them out and writing the Constitution of the United States. Now, Thomas Jefferson had written the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, but when it got passed in the Virginia legislature in 1786, he was over in France being the ambassador. And so he was in France at the time of the Constitutional Convention. He was not there. His lieutenant, so to speak, James Madison, had been the member of the Virginia Assembly that had gotten that act passed, and he, of course, is the one who shows up at the Constitutional Convention having done his homework. I can just imagine this tiny little man weighted down with papers and books. He's read everything. He's studied every form of government going way back to the Greeks and the Romans. He is ready to go with his document, the Virginia Plan. So Jefferson, I think, and Madison to a large degree expected that into this Constitution they were coming up with, they would come out with some statement guaranteeing religious rights. In other words, disestablishing religion, but guaranteeing you your right to do it. And that was not in it. And so the argument for not putting this in the Constitution was, well, all 13 states already have that, and so religious rights, religious freedom is guaranteed by your state constitution. But you know, that wasn't exactly true, because Connecticut still had a state church, congregational. Massachusetts still had a state church, and you were required to pay taxes to the church. Whether you went or not was irrelevant, but everyone was taxed to support these state churches. Connecticut didn't get rid of their state church until 1818, I don't think, and Massachusetts was, I think, the last one, and I think it was 1833. Andrew Jackson was president before Massachusetts disestablished their state church. So, the Constitution is written, it is polished off, it is ratified. James Madison certainly was not totally happy with the document, but it was a compromise, and it was a stronger national government. So it goes out to the 13 states to be ratified, and all we have to have is 9. We don't have to have unanimity. We figured we wouldn't get unanimity, and we didn't until they were coerced. But it gets down to, now we get 9 states having ratified the Constitution, but unfortunately New York and Virginia, the two big states, had not ratified it. And really, if you really want to see where the struggle over ratification, states' superiority or a national government with superiority, you need to look at all of the documents associated with the Virginia Ratification Convention, because that is where the bulk of the fight took place, and Virginia and New York, and it squeaked out, passing by just the thinnest of margins. Now in Virginia, the big argument was it doesn't have any guarantee of our rights. And so at this convention, Thomas Jefferson guaranteed to the people of Virginia that if they would go ahead and ratify the Constitution, as soon as the new government takes effect, he would write an amendment that would guarantee not only your rights to religion, religious freedom, but it would guarantee all these other rights that people had come to feel were sacred, the right of free speech, what becomes the Bill of Rights. Now, what about Patrick Henry? Patrick Henry was strongly, loudly opposed to the Constitution. He wouldn't go to the convention because he said he smelled a rat, and what are they going to do? They're going to take away our freedom. We're going to go back to big government again. He certainly didn't want that. So he was very loud and very vocal in his opposition to the Constitution. He lost. All right. We get the First Amendment, which guarantees all of those rights, one of which happens to be the right to have freedom of religion. No one can deny you that right. And so ever since the Constitution was ratified and that amendment was added to it, which was 1791, we've debated what that means, and we are still debating that subject even today. Jefferson himself talked about a wall of separation between the church and the government. That was not a new idea. You will remember that Roger Williams, that was one of his reasons for getting thrown out of Massachusetts when he was banished by the Puritan leadership, but it didn't say that we don't have religion. What if it did? If anything, I really think because they say we have this separation, it pretty much has guaranteed us that religion is going to be sort of at the center of life here in the United States. What this is, freedom of religion in 1791 was something absolutely brand new. No one, no country, anywhere in the world had ever had freedom, complete freedom of religion. Even after those churches in Germany left the Catholic Church, they didn't open up to religious toleration. And there were a lot of people that thought that religious freedom was gonna be the downfall of the United States simply because they felt you had to have some control. And religion brings in a moral authority. It brings a way to sort of coerce people. Now, you know, I think that we would probably agree that you can control things with the rule of law, but there was a lot of uneasiness about this. So here we've got this new idea, and it's all based on individual choice. You have a choice. Now, where that is going to really get on the stage is certainly not over there in those 13 states. They're already set up and running. Where it's going to really play out is over here across the mountains. After the American Revolution, the United States extends all the way to the Mississippi River, but the land between the top of the Appalachian Mountains, I realize that my map is backward, the top of the Appalachian Mountains over here and the Mississippi River over here is part of the United States. It is not a state, but it is property. And Tennessee, the land of Tennessee, was an extension of North Carolina, Kentucky, more or less, an extension of Virginia, and then you have that Ohio region, which was where all the trouble started in the first place, the French and Indian War. So you've got this land over here, and okay, what are we going to do? And let me just assure you, people were jumping over the mountains as fast as they could go. Some estimate that there were, I think this was in that PBS program on God in America, 200 wagons of people crossing the mountains, they estimate, into the Ohio region. So the population in this area is growing rapidly. Of course, it's going to threaten the Indians. We're going to have a lot of tension. Tecumseh will rise up among those tribes and say, you know, they're pushing us out, they're grabbing our land. If we don't come together, they're going to get rid of all of us. He was actually right in that regard. But there is a huge movement. Okay, we've got Americans living in this area that belongs to America, the United States, and it's not a state. So what are we going to do about this? So Thomas Jefferson actually had his hand in this. He came up with a process by which territories could become a state. And this is in two documents that were actually passed by the old Articles of Confederation Congress before the Constitution went into effect. The Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance. And they in particular dealt with, the place they were trying to deal with was what you and I call Ohio today. But it sort of set forth a blueprint for how any future territory could become a state. And it's a kind of a two-step process. After you've got 5,000 people, your territory can have its own legislature, and then when your population gets to 60,000 people, you can apply for statehood. So that document is in effect when we roll over to the Constitution, this stronger central government. Oh, one more thing about the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery in this territory. So that was passed, and we have a process. So here we got people flying over the mountains from Virginia and North Carolina into Kentucky and to Tennessee. And there had been an effort in East Tennessee only, not all over the place, not here, but to create a separate state and secede from North Carolina about 1784. All of you know some part of this story probably. They attempted, the East Tennessee counties of North Carolina attempted to create the state of Franklin, and they tried to secede from North Carolina, but they weren't able to do that. We would have been in a mess if they had, because we still belonged to North Carolina. We didn't have very many settlers over here, but Middle Tennessee was not part of the state of Franklin. So as soon as the Constitution goes into effect, there is a vocal movement to create a different territory down here south of the River Ohio. The Northwest Territory is north of the River Ohio. The Ohio River is the border between Kentucky and Ohio, Kentucky and Indiana, Kentucky and Illinois. So that was the Northwest Territory. Now we're going to have a Southwest Territory, territory south of the River Ohio. So the people who had come over here and were already here, James and Charlotte Robertson, John Sevier, the Donaldsons, all of these people had come for one real reason: land. They saw the opportunity to own not only land, but I think you will agree, beautiful land. And it was there pretty cheap or free for the takings if you really want to just go fight with the Indians and push them out. So all of these folks who had come over here were interested in the land. They were entrepreneurs. The Robertsons and Donaldsons were Scots-Irish. The Seviers, John Sevier was a French Huguenot, Jean Sevier. But you know, in Tennessee, we call that general from France Lafayette. So you know how we like to make our own names here. So these people have come for land, and over there in North Carolina is a big-time land speculator by the name of William Blount. William Blount had met George Washington. He had been a delegate from North Carolina to the Constitutional Convention. He had signed the Constitution, and so as soon as Congress creates this territory south of the River Ohio, he is letting President Washington know very quickly that he wants to be the territorial governor. All right, now why did he want to be this? Well, over there in North Carolina, which had been the next to the last state to ratify the Constitution, over there in North Carolina, the state had not been able to pay its soldiers who had fought in the American Revolution. So the way that they paid their soldiers who had fought in the war for the state of North Carolina was to give them a piece of paper that is a deed to some property over here. You are getting 1,000 acres in a place called Sumner County. Now, Fred, don't you want to come immediately? Don't you want to come and build your cabin? Well, if Fred thought going to Sumner County from Charlotte was like going to the moon, he would sell his piece of paper to William Blount for a very tiny bit of money, but after all, cash is better than a piece of paper, right? And William Blount and his brother amassed thousands of pieces of paper in land grants. So William Blount wanted to come over here to check on his operation. He had never been over here before. He had never set foot over here. So he comes in to the territory south of the River Ohio is created 1791. He's actually really a pretty smart politician. He knows he's coming into a place where people don't know him and don't care anything about rules. You know, they've come over here and please leave me alone. I want to do what I please. And so he goes to every county. There are 4 in East Tennessee and 3 here in Middle Tennessee. The 3 here in Middle Tennessee are Davidson, Sumner, and Tennessee County. And I guess you know we don't have a Tennessee County anymore. That's Robertson County, sort of. So he comes in, meets with everybody, and I can only imagine what these meetings were like. You know, guys, you don't know me, but we're all in this together. We're all here to make money, right? So let's work together. And so they begin attracting people as fast as they can. Come and buy this land from me, and come. And so the population gets up to 60,000 by 1795. And there is a vote. I can't imagine how an election could have taken place. I don't know what the election poll reporters and poll officials had to do, Jenny, on those elections, how easy it was to get to your polling place. But nonetheless, they had an election. You want to be a state or not. And the people over here in Middle Tennessee didn't want to be a state. They voted no, because if we become a state, you know what it's going to do for us? Nothing except raise our taxes. Now, all of you remember the horn hawkers? Everybody remembers them? So there is a reason why people in Tennessee are anti-tax. It goes back. They have a proud heritage of being anti-tax. So the population was, of course, in those 4 eastern counties, and the referendum won. So they go have a meeting January 1796 in Knoxville, draw up a constitution. Now, Tennessee today is operating under a constitution that was written in 1870. We have had 3 constitutions: the Constitution of 1796, a Constitution in 1834, and a Constitution in 1870. Now, let me just kind of point out here why we've had to have 2 and 3. It all had to do with slavery, all of it. Because 1834, the population of slaves is growing very rapidly in the western part of the state. Can you guess why? Cotton. And so consequently, the slave owners who wield a tremendous amount of power want to make sure they control their slaves. So we write the Constitution then. And then in 1870, after the Civil War, after kind of 4 years of, I wouldn't really call it myself, I would not call it radical Reconstruction, but after 4 years, the ex-Confederates in Tennessee come back into power. They are allowed to run for the General Assembly, and the ex-Confederates lead the charge to rewrite the Constitution, this time to make sure that they stay in control for here on out, and to be very specific. Well, what do you ex-Confederates want to control? Well, we want to control those people running around here who are our former slaves. We want to control them because we want to make sure we can figure out a way to keep them picking our cotton, because otherwise we're going to be in a financial crisis if we can't get our crops picked. So we've written the Constitution, but I'm stressing this for a reason. I realize I'm rambling, but I'm stretching this out here for a little bit of a reason. When the Constitution of Tennessee was written, Tennessee is going to become the 16th state. When the Constitution of Tennessee was written, Thomas Jefferson said it was the most nearly perfect Constitution he had ever seen. Of course, it's easier to do something if 15 others have already done it before you. The Tennessee Constitution was patterned largely on the Constitution of Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But there was one difference. Tennessee's Constitution, if you're an atheist, sorry, you can't hold office anywhere. But in Tennessee, all you have to do to vote and to hold office is to affirm a belief in the divinity. Now, do y'all get that? I know some of you do. That means you don't have to be a Christian. You could be a Jew. You could be a Muslim. You could be a Hindu. You could be all sorts of things. Or you could be nothing. Well, if you're nothing, you can't participate. But all you have to be is willing to affirm a belief in the divinity. Now, I know most of you do not see Tennessee as exactly a hotbed of liberalism. I know that. I know many of you. And why would these men up there in Knoxville not say Tennessee's a Christian state and you're going to have to believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and you're going to have to join a church, a Christian church. And you know, my students, I was talking about the Protestant Reformation last week, and they think that my rural students believe that Catholics are not Christians. So I had to do some enlightening up there. But why did these Tennesseans not put Christianity in our first Constitution? Because they are land speculators. Do you get it? In other words, I'm trying to sell land. I want as many people to come in here as possible who will come in to my state and buy some of this land. Well, I mean, you know, we might sell them that part over there on the other side of the river, Cheatham County. Heavens, we've got all sorts of stuff to sell here. So, this was put in the Constitution, in my personal opinion, as much as anything to enable the business side of the operation, the entrepreneurship. And they certainly were very eager for people, whether they were coming in from Charleston, whether they were coming in later down the Ohio River, they were very willing to welcome people to a degree. And so you will begin seeing Jews coming into Tennessee before the Civil War, and you will see that those Jews are generally German Jews, but not always, but they become very acculturated very rapidly into the society. Now, you know, you're going to have several other waves of people coming about 1900 from Eastern Europe, various religions, but they're going to largely come from New Orleans and up the Mississippi River. So you've got kind of a whole lot of diversity here, even though some people like to see us as being so very, very homogeneous. So Tennessee and the frontier, we're still the frontier even though we're a state. And this is really where the ideals of religious freedom are going to really become concrete. They're going to become something you can see the effects of this. Now, can you imagine in 1797 or 8 crossing the Appalachian Mountains? You build yourself a cabin out there, you start cutting down trees, you want to plant some corn, you want to survive, you want to cut next year some more trees, plant some more corn, you want to start your life here. Can you imagine, and of course none of us can, I mean, there are lots of people who never saw this many people in their entire life in one gathering. I mean, you just lived a very isolated life. So there was a tremendous amount of loneliness, I think, associated with coming across the mountains. And there's also some disillusionment. You know, I didn't know it was going to be that hard. I just didn't think it was going to be so isolated. Well, as you can imagine, these people, some of them get disillusioned to the point that they are really in a crisis mode. They want change. Now, keep that in mind. Let's talk about the Methodist. All right. You know, all the Methodists, know about the circuit riders. And all the Methodists know about the Wesleys, John and Charles. They were part of this holy club of which George Whitefield had joined. Now, the Wesleys saw themselves as Anglicans, but they wanted a little more, probably shouldn't use the word conservative, but they wanted a little more conservative view of religion. And they wanted a little more spirit, livening things up as much as anything. So the Wesleys really did not want to create a religious denomination. They had both been to Georgia, which was set up as a penal colony, an experiment. That sort of plays out their beliefs that you need to go out and tell people about your faith and try to bring people in. But after the American Revolution, it all kind of goes hand in hand. How easy do you think it was for those Anglicans, and of course that would be George Washington for sure, how easy was it for them to keep priests over here after independence? Well, the priests were all English, and who did we fight the war against? The English. So it's very difficult to get Anglican priests who want to come over here. And this simultaneously is going on with the Wesleys beginning to feel like they're a little more different than the Church of England than they thought. And so we have this kind of Americanization of the Anglican Church in a profound fashion that really becomes the Methodist Church. Now, the Methodist Church will zoom in number so that by the Civil War, it's by far the largest denomination in the United States. And these Methodists, remember, they have this need to be missionaries. Go save souls. And so going across the mountains, that looks like a great opportunity if you feel that you are called to go out and save souls. And you know, you don't really have to have much. You don't have to have an education. You don't have to have anything really but a horse and a Bible, right? So you just go over there and start preaching. And so here come these Methodist circuit riders, and they start preaching, and this kind of evolves into revivals or camp meetings. The idea of a camp meeting is that after you've gotten your seeds planted, everybody will come together, and as many as 10,000 people actually will end up coming to some of these things. They are huge, and they really take off after a very large camp meeting up in Kentucky at Cane Ridge. They are outdoor spectacles. You have 24-hour preaching. You preach for 5 hours, Fred, and Walt will preach for the next 5. You keep it going. You've got music, you've got trumpets, you've got guitars. There is singing and dancing. And on the fringe of these, I am told the spirit of a different kind worked. There were some other things going on the fringes of these things. But imagine, as a kid, wouldn't you think this was great fun? You're outdoors, you can go run off in the woods, you can take the girls off in the wood and kiss them, or you can do whatever you please, and people were having a big time. And so these were quite successful. So imagine you are over here, you're so lonesome, you never see anybody. You want a big change, and you go hear this preacher who calls for you to change your life. You have this religious experience, and you're a new person, and you're like all of these other people. So, you know, you go to this thing and everybody's talking about what bad sinners they were, and, you know, then they start talking about being filled with the Spirit, and you can just imagine how popular this was. Now, there were camp sites all over rural Kentucky and rural Tennessee, but most of them were tiny. But up in Sumner County, there is a Presbyterian preacher who comes into the area named James McCready, and James McCready he's really a pretty good preacher. People like to hear him, and so he sees those Methodists, and yes, James McCready has a college education because he's been licensed as a Presbyterian. But there's some things about Presbyterianism he's really beginning to question. And one of those things he's beginning to question is this whole notion of everybody has to adhere to one doctrine called the Westminster Confession. He doesn't necessarily think he believes in that anymore, and he doesn't necessarily believe in predestination because he thinks you need to be out there working and doing other things, exert your free will to work. So here he comes into this area. He goes up to Logan County, Kentucky, and then we'll come into Sumner County, and he is quite the effective preacher. At one service, he served, I'm looking for the number here, 11,000 people communion. Now that was some outdoor church service, I can imagine. Well, now, if any of you are Presbyterian, you know how the presbytery is going to react to this guy. Out. So he is defrocked, so to speak, but that doesn't matter. He's such a popular preacher. He's even more popular now. He's kind of out there on his own. So you've got James McCready. Now, another guy that shows up in Logan County, Kentucky, is a man named Barton Stone. Barton Stone is also licensed as a Presbyterian preacher. But just like James McCready, he has been questioning what the Presbyterians make him do. He doesn't necessarily think he should have to do this. And so he keeps preaching, and he is so powerful. Barton Stone is so effective as a preacher. When his presbytery, which I think was the Springfield Presbytery, attempts to defrock him or disband what he's doing, instead the whole presbytery ended up disbanding. So what Barton Stone is so effective in communicating is you don't need the Westminster Confession, you don't need anything, all you need is a Bible. In fact, what I want to do is I want to restore the New Testament church. I don't want to go through all this Catholic business, then Protestant business, then Anglican business, and then whatever. I want to restore the New Testament church. So he starts, after he is no longer a Presbyterian, he starts calling himself, and his people do the same, we are just simply Christians. So Barton Stone becomes quite popular, and he really is very good at figuring out a way that nobody else has yet figured out as to how to get his name out there. He starts publishing a newspaper called the Christian Messenger. Now, keep that in mind because, you know, this kind of Nashville kind of hotbed of publishing, or it used to be, right? So, all right, 1826, he starts publishing this. He wants to restore the New Testament church. And that thing is read, the Christian Messenger is read in the North, it's read in the South. It is very, very popular. One of the people who, some of you will recognize this name, became sort of a follower of Stone was Talbert Fanning, who will end up here in Middle Tennessee before the Civil War running an agricultural Bible college, so to speak. And one of the people who will, right before the Civil War, go to that school, which actually I think was out there by the airport, is a young man named David Lipscomb. So see, we're going to have some ties here. All right, so Talbot Fanning gets into this. Now, okay, let's add Alexander Campbell to the story here, because all of you have heard about Alexander Campbell, probably. If you've heard people referred to as Campbellites. So, Alexander Campbell is an Irish Presbyterian. He has been licensed as a Presbyterian, but he sees himself from day one as a reformer. He is at odds with the requirements of the church, so Alexander Campbell, will come to the United States, and it turns out, he has a lot of ideas that are absolutely the same as Barton Stone. He primarily preaches in Pennsylvania and Maryland, and he disagrees with the Presbyterians over a lot of things, but the thing he really complains about is infant baptism. That these children, if you've got to have this conversion experience, this turning around, these children should not be baptized into the church. Well, guess who really agrees with him? The Presbyterians don't. The Baptists. The Baptists say, yeah, you're preaching our song. You're singing our song. This is what we believe. So, he is no longer a Presbyterian, and he becomes a Baptist. So he starts preaching as a Baptist preacher, and he begins to publish his own newspaper called the Christian Baptist. Just like Barton Stone, he says, I want to restore the old New Testament church. We've gotten so far from it with all these stained glass windows and all this stuff. I want to restore the new church, the New Testament church, just like the Apostle Paul. Let's go way, way back. So, he is quite popular, and he will be very effective, just like Barton Stone was, in getting his word out. Well, the Baptists do not have a governing body, but the Baptists do have some cooperative ventures. And so it is that the Baptists in Virginia will reject Alexander Campbell from these cooperative ventures, and so he's kind of pushed out there by himself. So Alexander Campbell will give up publishing the Christian Baptist, and his new publication is called The Millennial Harbinger. He has a big readership, and he has lots of followers here in Nashville. His followers here in Nashville are down at the Baptist Church, and so the Baptist Church, yes, the First Baptist Church will kind of split between the Campbellites and the Baptists, and most everybody went to be a Campbellite or a Christian, and the Baptists had to start over before the Civil War. But can you imagine this? He comes into town, preaches. He likes Middle Tennessee. Two of his daughters will marry sons of Talbot Fanning, I think. He has a lot of interest here, and he has a lot of following. So on Christmas Day in 1830, imagine taking your grandchildren to this on Christmas Day. Obadiah Jennings, that sounds kind of biblical, don't you think? Obadiah, who is the minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Nashville, and Alexander Campbell have a 5-hour debate on Christmas Day. Can you imagine taking the kids to that one? So, I don't think either one of them moved an inch, but it probably was great entertainment. So here you see these denominations that don't have a lot of rules and regulations becoming very popular. And you can understand, I mean, kind of the way this goes here. Now, before Alexander Campbell ever came to town, there were Presbyterians here for sure, but they had been very slow in feeling a need to organize a church. And then you have some of these folks moving over into the Dickson County area west of here, and well, you know, you can't even get a college-educated preacher, a licensed preacher, to come to Dickson County, Tennessee. And so these folks will have a meeting, 1811, I think, while all of this other is going on. And they say, well, we're going to create our own Presbyterian denomination. And really, as much as anything, I think they're kind of molding their religion to fit their economic circumstances. So they meet over in Dickson County, and they will create a new denomination called the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And the Cumberland Presbyterian Church is very popular in the South and in rural areas. And for a long time, we had a big Cumberland Presbyterian Church downtown in Nashville, and the Cumberland Presbyterians were probably more ecumenical than other groups were. But nonetheless, we've got all of this going on here. Now, Professor Paul Conkin, whom I know some of you know, really argues very forcefully that Tennessee's big contribution to American culture is religion. All these denominations, both before and after the Civil War, that had their very, very beginning right here in Tennessee. Now, they have another kind of revival independently of what's going on here. They have another revival up in New York State in the kind of 1810s and 1820s. You know that the big engineering feat up there is the building of the Erie Canal. We're going to go up the Hudson River and cut a canal over to get water to the Great Lakes. And so the Erie Canal is being built. And you can just imagine, any kind of time there's a big building project going on, you know that there's going to be a fair amount of straying from the path. And so I always believe that it's the mothers who are the first ones to get really worried. Oh my gosh, look at all the opportunities my kids have to get into mischief. And these towns along the canal were not exactly religious. They were pretty sinful places. And so a young man in New York has a religious experience, not unlike all these other people. His name is Charles Grandison Finney, and he starts preaching. And he preaches this need for conversion, this calling for a personal experience and an encounter. And Charles Grandison Finney is equally effective. He's as effective as all the ones down here. And this whole area along the Erie Canal becomes known as the burned out district, because he has gone in there and he has burned out sin as he has saved these folks from all of this mischief that they could get into. So all of this is going on, and out of this comes this notion that this building, and I know some of you have heard this referred to, not this Belmead, but you've heard churches referred to as the church house, not the church or the temple, but the church house. And this was all part of this Second Great Awakening, that there's nothing special about this place. We don't need these stained glass windows. We don't need anything fancy here. It is just another place. It's kind of like the country store. So you don't have to really do much of anything to come to the country store. You're going to be welcome. You're going to feel at home at the church house. And don't you see that really coming back to us today with all of these community churches which are attracting a lot of people? I see some connections there between those. Now, public education. Let's talk about that for just a minute. In New York, the Quakers have started a school system. They have established the Public School Society because the Quakers believe that we need moral instruction of our children, and even that we will use the Bible to give this moral instruction to our children. Well, 1820s and 30s, we start seeing a large number of immigrants pouring into New York City, and Philadelphia and Boston as well, but we're going to talk about New York for just a minute. They are pouring in. They are Irish, starving immigrants, and you know they are Catholic. Well, this is totally frightening to many of the Christians who believe that Catholics are just the reincarnation of Satan. Everything is black and white. Us, good. Catholics, bad. Us, freedom. Them, slavery. You get it? So you got all these people who are very nervous about these Catholics. Well, the Catholics, they may be poor, but they do want their kids educated, and they send their kids to school, and it's just anti-Catholic this and anti-Catholic this, and the Pope is Satan, and da-da-da-da-da, and they get very upset. So there's not a whole lot that they can do because they don't have any clout. They're poor people, but they go to their parish priest. And their parish priest is, one of them happens to be a man by the name of John Hughes. And John Hughes feels that the Spirit has filled him, and he has a moral obligation to try to fix this problem. The Catholic children are being discriminated against. Now, I know if you are in particular a Jew or a Catholic and grew up in Tennessee or many parts of the South, you know how these folks felt, because you go into school and you're getting this kind of doctrine poured into you whether you want it or your parents want it or not. So he is really creating quite a stir when he goes to the board and says, if you're going, this is the City Council of New York, if you're going to pay for education for these public schools, yes, we are doing that. If you're going to pay for this education, you need to also give us, the diocese, money for our own schools, because your schools are discriminating against us, and we are being treated unfairly. And this is quite a big debate. There is a huge debate about this, because all of the non-Catholics, well, we're just teaching them the Christian religion, but it's very anti-Catholic. So the City Council, after several days of debate, will have a vote, and Hughes loses. 15 or 16 to 1 was the vote. I mean, one person voted to support Catholic schools. Now, this guy is smart. It is the City Council of New York. It is a political institution. So what do you think he does? He helps his parishioners get themselves citizenship and get them registered to vote. And then what does he very gently do? Tells them how to vote. And guess what? After they see this political bloc, a substantial political bloc of Catholics, they finally agree to not give money to the Catholic schools, but to take the religion out of the New York schools. And so that's a whole other thing we've been debating ever since. We've been going at it over and over and over. Now, The country is growing, and the big theme of American history from about 1815, when we fight our second war with England and the end of the War of 1812, to the Civil War is expansion, territorial expansion. And you know, you really wouldn't think we'd be having such a crisis over slavery if we could just ignore it. But unfortunately, the population is growing so high and all these people are spreading west, and every time they spread west, they want to become a state, and every time they want to become a state, we have to face this subject of slavery. It is right in our face. Shall that territory be brought into the Union as free or slave? And so it starts in 1819 when Missouri is ready for statehood. Thomas Jefferson writes later, I believe he was writing to John Adams at this time, it was like a fire bell in the night, the subject of slavery in Missouri, and it filled him with alarm, and he thought it was the death knell of our country. So, from here on out, we are going to start fighting about slavery. And one of the consequences of this Great Awakening, out of the Great Awakening comes this belief that we need to make our society better. And so across the country, you see primarily women, but they are forming these reform societies to take care of the orphans, or a poorhouse, or a hospital. But we have reformers, a mental health institution. We're not going to call them prison places for incarceration. They will be called penitentiaries, where these convicts, these sinners, do penance. And so you can imagine that out of all of this are going to come a society that wants to abolish slavery. And so the abolitionist movement takes off in the 1830s, and it's going to hit the churches the very hardest, because the abolitionists believe that God really is against slavery. And so you will see it starting first with the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians in 1837 and 38 split between North and South. The Methodists in 1844, North and South, and the Baptists in 1845. Now this is where we're going to pick up next week, so I will tell you all about this, and I'm not really going to say much about the Civil War. We've got you have plenty of opportunities to hear all you want about the Civil War, but I want to move on to the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War next week, but I'm going to start with the splitting of the churches, because let me tell you, if the churches, the denominations can't hold it together, is there any hope for holding the country together? And so 15 years after these splits, after the Baptist split, 11 states secede from the Union. Now, I am short on time today. I see the symphony comers coming in, but I think I've got about 4 or 5 minutes for questions. Yes?
In New York City, wasn't there a step where the city council decided they could not fund any schools, and that was the creation of the Catholic school system in the United States?
Well, the Catholic school system was created in New York City because the question was, didn't New York at one time the city council say, okay, we're not going to fund any schools? Yes, that is. And so they took the funding away, and what that did was really hurt the public schools where all the Protestants were going. And so the Catholic school system was established. But one thing about the Catholic school system, you've got all these women who have this really, actually, very independent place in the Catholic religion, and these are nuns. And so you see these nuns who join teaching orders, like the Dominicans, for instance, and they will be ideal for keeping this new school system operating. The Dominicans came to Nashville in 1860 and built a convent up on the hill overlooking downtown Nashville. The St. Cecilia Convent, it celebrated its big anniversary last year, and if you have never been up there, I really encourage you to put that on your list. It is one of the most beautiful, peaceful places I have ever been, and you really should go up there. And the order, the Dominicans, is one of the fastest growing religious orders in the world. I expected to see 25 little old lady nuns when I went up there to speak, and there were more of them than there are of you here today. And they're mostly, I'd say somebody who knows some statistics, correct me, raise your hand. But from my observation, I would say that 75% of the women in that order are under the age of 40. There were very few little old lady nuns. It is rapidly growing, and I'll tell you, there's a sense of peace about those people that we could all benefit from. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable place. I encourage you to go up there and visit. I hadn't been up there until about 2 years ago, so I encourage you. Yes?
You mentioned Finney in New York. Did that result in a different denomination?
No. It didn't. See, I feel like the Methodists were the big recipients of all of that. He said, did Finney create his own denomination? And no, the other denominations took advantage of what he was preaching.
Did the LDS thing start about the same time?
The Latter-day Saints. Oh, thank you very much for mentioning that, because I think that's really something I need to give a little attention to next week, because we have all this religious experimentation that really comes out of the Second Great Awakening. And you have these utopian societies, you have Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints, you have all of these things all coming up out of this. We can do whatever we please. One last question.
Were there any objections by anybody in the 19th century to teaching religion in the public school?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, there were. There were lots of people who didn't like it, but, you got to get your voice out there. And, that's often a problem, is that some people may not like things, but they won't complain about them. And that's where Father Hughes came into the picture. He was willing to be the voice of people who didn't have a voice. But yeah, there were people who didn't think you should have religious teaching, but believe me, there are people in Tennessee that very strongly believe we should, even today, have the Bible in the classroom and be using it. So it's still a subject that hasn't been fully played out yet. We have got to go. The others are coming. I've got to teach a class. I'd like to go stay here all day. Thank you.
The next person understands what you did, like 3 weeks after they get there. But that's a good question. I just think there's great people everywhere. If you spend time building their environment, get out of their way. You won't believe what they can do. It's not hard. It's really not. You guys can do this. And it's fun. I mean, it's really fun. So I saw something back there. Yeah.
You talk a lot about how important culture is, and you obviously believe in it, the passion that comes with that. What if you find yourself in the middle of an organization where the culture is either ranging from a city to somewhere in the middle of the lacking passion? How do you change that? What do you suggest as words of wisdom for someone who's not necessarily at the top, but someone in the middle?
Yeah, I think the only thing you can do is you can say, okay, what piece of the pie can I influence? And I'm going to focus on that piece. Because when you try to change the people above you before they're ready, you usually get your suitcase out. And so I think you have to say, what's my sphere of influence and what can I really change? And guess what? When you do that, guess what people start to see and say? I want to do that. And it kind of does spread, but I think you got to really manage your sphere and say, I can change my team for now, and then we're going to find the next place that we're going to influence. But if you try to change the company or you try to change a group and you have somebody who's not up for that, it's just knocking your head against the wall. It's not really that good for your career either, from what I can see. It's dangerous. But it can happen. But I mean, it does get slippery. But I feel your pain, because I know you guys are sitting in the middle of something and you're going, that all sounds really good, but I have no chance of doing that where I am because these guys don't get it or these guys don't get it. And that's unfortunate. But you can make a difference, and when you do, the word gets out and it starts to do that. So just make sure you start there, and then it'll fan out, because guess what? People love to be part of something that's fun, that allows them to perform like they couldn't believe they could perform. They love that. They really do. But it's hard.
We've got a reception outside, and I want you to please join me in thanking Doug for
Great.
being here.
Thank you. I'll say, yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Metro Parks.
We'd still be here.
Yeah, I think it ain't 40. It's not 40.
Yeah, I bet half of them, which is good too. You wouldn't have gotten 40 on the trail.
They're gonna get some stupid out there. About 30 of them. I think, you know, it's kind of hard to count.
Estimation.
Close to 40, more than 30.
That ain't close to a 40. I know you know a 40. I'm talking about 30.
It's 30. Might want to get on the front side. While we were there, we rescued this. Nothing to do with our piece. So just want you to know, like we tried. Go right back in there. guy left his tripod. Oh boy, that was not right. But I always think it's going to work. It's going to be simple. And then I had no idea how destroyed that piece was.
It's in chilled preservation fluid until it gets to the islet isolation lab. And we like to have that limited to, our goal is about 6 hours, and in terms of getting the isolation procedure going. Then the isolation takes about 10 hours, and then the islets are in culture. And what we're actually doing now that's different from Edmonton, we used to think that the islets had to go right in the patient. And our culture techniques have improved so that we can keep islets alive in culture now for days. We're still not comfortable going on days and days, but we do keep them in culture for about 48 to 72 hours, which enables us to bring the patient in, induct immunosuppression. There's often an initial cytokine release when you induce immunosuppression, and what this enables us to do is have that cytokine release dissipated by the time the islets go in the patient. Similarly, the islets upregulate tissue factor and other pro-thrombotic and pro-inflammatory proteins through the process of being in a brain-dead donor, procured, isolated, and so we let them sort of chill out, so to speak, during that period. And so we think that some of these improvements have really helped us increase the amount of engrafted islet mass when we do this procedure.
In mouse models that I've seen for this transplant, after implanting either isolated islets or pieces of pancreas, you kind of, with no islets of the animal's own, you kind of see it swell or proliferate. Do you see the same thing?
We do not believe that there is any proliferation of the cells. We also primarily receive islets from adult donors. That's not to say you couldn't use a pediatric donor, but there's been a lot less experience with pediatric donors. Pediatric donor pancreas is much better pancreas for whole pancreas transplantation because the vessels are young and pliable, and they're probably best utilized for whole pancreas. So our adult donors, we don't believe that there's any regeneration, although it's an active line of investigation that even if we may not normally see regeneration in an adult pancreas, can we stimulate that pancreas to regenerate? And certainly we would love to be able to treat these islets when they're in culture for 48 to 72 hours with some growth factor cocktail or other a transgenic approach, something to stimulate proliferation so that we could even take one donor pancreas and treat 2 patients. So there's a lot of investigation going into can we get adult human islets to regenerate or look at other sources that have greater potential. Great question, and we really at Penn. Oh, I'm sorry. That question was about the role of whole pancreas transplantation as a treatment for type 1 diabetes, and we really find the role of whole pancreas and islet transplantation to be very complementary. The best outcomes with a whole pancreas transplant for type 1 diabetes come when it's transplanted at the same time as a kidney for a patient with diabetic nephropathy receiving a kidney transplant. And the reason for that, we think, has to do with the fact that when you transplant a kidney, you're restoring 50% of the renal mass, and the serum creatinine serves as a very sensitive indicator of rejection. When the pancreas comes from the same donor as the kidney, when you recognize rejection in the kidney, you can treat the patient, and you're treating rejection in both the kidney and the pancreas. Otherwise, when you transplant a pancreas with 100% islet mass, you may not see hyperglycemia until the rejection has eliminated the majority of the pancreas. And at that point, it's too late to recover. So we like to transplant the pancreas with the kidney. Pancreases that are transplanted alone, that is separate from a kidney, are done, but have a much higher risk of immunologic rejection. And because of the exocrine component that's going with it, we're not very comfortable biopsying the pancreas as much as we are biopsying a kidney. So, and then there are technical difficulties both with the pancreas and the recipient. That is, the vascular supply to the pancreas, as you probably all know fresh from anatomy, the arcade of the pancreaticoduodenal artery and the splenic artery, and you have to reconstruct that vascular anastomosis to the recipient with donor iliac vessels. And if you have a patient, an older type 1 diabetic with hard arteries, or the pancreas is coming from an older patient with hard arteries, you can't do the vascular reconstruction. And so those are the pancreases that are not usable for a whole pancreas that we would then like to isolate islets and then use those islets to treat patients who are not getting a kidney and so might not otherwise be able to benefit from what we'd like to call beta cell replacement. So whether it's from a whole pancreas or an islet, there are roles for both. Great question. So how long is immunosuppression required, and what effect does the immunosuppression have on their autoimmune disease? And the first question is, we know that unfortunately at this point the immunosuppression is required indefinitely. So if you stop immunosuppression, your body will reject the islet graft. And so another huge area of investigation is tolerizing regimens for immunosuppression. So what we can do to trick the immune system into recognizing an allogeneic tissue as being their own. And with the goal of then minimizing the long-term risks of transplantation by being able to avoid immunosuppression. But we're not there yet. In terms of the effect on autoimmunity, we know from early work in pancreas transplantation when some of the first pancreas transplants were actually done twin to twin between one twin who did not have type 1 diabetes donating half their pancreas to their other twin who did have type 1 diabetes, so that you have an HLA identical system where immunosuppression would not be required for alloimmunity, but unfortunately, rapidly, autoimmunity recurred in the transplanted pancreas and it failed. So we do know that even after years and years of type 1 diabetes, that memory response to the beta cell persists. But the medicines that we use now in allogeneic transplantation, thymoglobulin, a polyclonal T-cell depleting antibody, tacrolimus, which is a calcineurin inhibitor, much like cyclosporin, these agents have all been used and shown to be beneficial in autoimmune diabetes, but have not been accepted because of the risk at a young age of starting someone on long-term immunosuppression. But we do know that these same drugs have effects on autoimmunity, but we also realize that when we lose pancreas and islet grafts, that oftentimes it still is a recurrence of autoimmunity, which these patients continue to be at risk for. Well, so the master's degree, in large part, when you're doing your research training, it's helpful to get some didactic work. And that helpfulness, I do mean that it was helpful that I was able to actually take statistics and epidemiology courses. I was able to take electives in basic sciences. So I took electives with the PhD students on cell and molecular biology and basic genetics. So stuff that it'd been a long time since I'd taken some of those courses in college, and a lot had happened to these fields. And so it was really helpful for me to have that structured course time. There are also, for what I do in patient-oriented research, courses in research ethics and things that were very practical in terms of how do you really get true informed consent, and what considerations do you need to make sure are in place to ensure patient safety. And to hear this from trained bioethicists was really helpful as part of my training. Now, what was also helpful is that the training programs that are supported by the NIH also like for you to be getting this type of didactic training. So being able to participate in a master's program was part of that K-12 award. It was expected that you were going to get this additional didactic training, which, so it helps you get funded to get your research started, but it also really does help you with your research and being sure that you're doing things right.
But it was done in parallel with the clinical research you were doing, right?
Yeah.
You left for 2 years.
Yeah. So, now one thing too about the support of the NIH CAPE programs is that it makes it really helpful that there's tuition support built in to the funding. So between there was some institutional support based on whatever your level of your just being employed there. You had some coursework that you could take each semester that didn't cost anything, and the additional courses were picked up by the K-12 program, so that master's program didn't cost my mother anything more than the medical school and college. So that was tremendously beneficial. Now, what Al also said, I started that program. I actually didn't get my degree until 2007, and I got away with that because I was in the first class for that master's program, and it was, they still didn't have it quite all that well organized. Now they really make sure that students get their courses done on a timely fashion. But as Al said, I was really busy with the research I was doing as part of that during that time, and so I didn't mind waiting till the course on research measurements opened up next year because I was busy. But there's lots of ways of doing it, and these programs exist as well in clinical epidemiology, biostatistics, as well as these translational research programs.
So any other questions for Dr. Rivers? Okay, so Mike, I guess one of the points though that I hear you making is that, even though you were clinically trained, you went to medical school, you did your residency, you did your clinical fellowship, and now you're doing patient-oriented research, that you still needed additional training. You still needed additional skills to do clinical research. So one sort of misconception is that because I'm a clinician, I can do clinical research, and that's not true. So whether you're going to do basic research or clinical research, you need additional training at some point in your career. And we'll talk more about the times that you might fit that in. But would you agree with that?
And I could have answered your question better before, but the coursework that's involved in a translational research program is writing a protocol, writing a grant, writing a consent form related to the ethics I talked. But these are all skills and things that you have to do repeatedly, and knowing how to do it well, and knowing how to get your protocol not only has to be scientifically sound, and that's important, but it also has to be ethically sound. And you also want to be able to convey that information very transparently. That is, you want reviewers. You're going to have reviewers on IRBs, reviewers at your research centers, advisory committee, reviewers at NIH, external advisory board reviewers. All these people are going to be reading what you write, and you need training in how to convey what you're doing is responsible and well thought, and that you don't learn in medical school, and that's really what this type of research training is extremely helpful with.
All right, great. Good. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. How about lunch?